The episode was called The Secret Path. It begins on a normal day. Peppa, George, Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig are walking through the forest. The weather is warm, the sun is shining, and birds are singing in the trees. George walks ahead, holding his dinosaur, and sometimes stops to look at flowers, stones, and little insects on the ground. Peppa is looking around carefully when she suddenly notices a narrow path between the trees that she has never seen before. It looks like a small trail leading deeper into the forest. "Daddy, look!" Peppa says. "There's a new path here." Daddy Pig looks into the forest and seems surprised. I've walked here many times, but I don't remember this path." Peppa becomes very curious. "Let's see where it goes." The family carefully walks along the path. It twists between the trees and slowly becomes narrower. Sometimes the branches hang so low that they have to bend down to pass. Leaves rustle softly in the wind. George walks ahead, holding his dinosaur. "Dinosaur walking," he says, pretending his dinosaur is exploring the forest too. After a while, the trees begin to open up, and in front of them appears a small lake. The water is very calm and smooth, like a mirror. Tall grass grows around it and dragonflies fly over the surface. Peppa stops and says in surprise, "I've never seen this place before." Mummy Pig smiles. Sometimes forests have little secret places. Peppa and George begin playing near the water. George places a leaf on the lake like it is a tiny boat, and Peppa throws small stones to make circles in the water. Then Peppa suddenly notices something on the other side of the lake. "Look," she says. Across the water between the trees, they can see a small wooden house. It stands quietly on the far side of the lake, almost hidden by leaves and branches. Daddy Pig looks carefully. "Interesting. I didn't know there was a house here." Peppa looks at it closely. "Maybe someone lives there." George looks at the house too and quietly says, "House." The little house looks old but neat. From far away it seems very quiet and a little mysterious. Peppa thinks for a moment and then says, "Let's come back tomorrow and visit the house." Daddy Pig smiles. "That's a good idea, but now it's time to go home." The family walks back through the forest along the same path. The next day, Peppa leads everyone confidently to the place where the secret path was. She walks between the trees and looks around. But when they reach the spot, Peppa suddenly stops. The path is gone. There is only tall grass and normal trees. Peppa looks around carefully. "It was here, right here." Daddy Pig looks around too. "Maybe we walked a different way yesterday." Peppa shakes her head. "No, the path was here." George quietly says, "House." But now there is no path, no lake, and no small house between the trees. Mummy Pig says, "Sometimes forests can be mysterious." The family continues their walk along another path. Peppa turns around one more time, and for just a moment it almost looks like a narrow path appears again between the trees, leading deep into the forest. The episode was called The Longest Bus. It begins on a normal morning. Peppa gets ready for school, puts on her backpack, and walks to the bus stop, where Susie, Pedro, Rebecca, and the other children are already waiting. They talk while waiting for the school bus. Soon, a bus appears around the corner, but it looks very different from usual. It is very long. First, the front of the bus appears, then another section, and then another one. Pedro says in surprise, "That's the longest bus I've ever seen." The bus stops and the doors open. As always, Miss Rabbit is the driver. "Good morning, children," she says. "Good morning, Miss Rabbit," the children reply. Peppa steps inside and immediately notices that the bus is much bigger on the inside than it looks from the outside. The first part looks like a normal school bus, but when the children walk farther, they see another door. Peppa opens it and finds another room. Inside, there are soft seats and small tables. "Wow," says Peppa, "you can play here." The children continue walking through the bus. The next door leads to a small room with shelves full of books. "It's a library," says Rebecca. The shelves are filled with books about animals, dinosaurs, and adventures. George picks up a dinosaur book and sits down to look at it. But the bus keeps going farther. The children open another door and discover a playroom with a soft carpet and a box of toys. Susie says it's the best bus ever. Peppa walks along the hallway and looks ahead. It almost seems like the bus never ends. "I wonder how long this bus really is," she says. Meanwhile, Miss Rabbit calmly drives the bus down the road. After some time, the bus begins to slow down. "We're at school," Miss Rabbit says. The children step outside and look at the bus again. From the outside, it now looks like just a long bus, but not nearly as huge as it seemed inside. Peppa smiles and says, "That was the most interesting bus ride ever." Susie nods and says, "And the longest." Pedro adds, "I wish we could ride a bus like that every day." Miss Rabbit smiles and says, "Sometimes the road to school can be a little adventure." The children walk toward the school building while still talking about the amazing bus, and Peppa turns around one more time to look at it before going inside. The episode was called The New School. It begins on an ordinary morning. Peppa is getting ready for school. She has breakfast with her family and puts on her backpack. George waves to her and says, "Bye, Peppa," and Mummy reminds her to listen carefully during lessons. Peppa happily walks along the path to school, thinking it will be a normal day. When she arrives, she notices that the school building looks a little different. It still looks like her school, but it seems slightly bigger. The windows look taller, and the door looks a little wider. Peppa stops and looks at the building. "Maybe I just didn't notice before," she says to herself. She walks inside and goes to her classroom. Her friends are already there. Susie, Pedro, Rebecca, and the other children are quietly talking. Madame Gazelle stands at the board. "Good morning, children," she says. "Good morning, Madame Gazelle," the children answer. The lesson begins normally. They draw, read, and answer questions. But Peppa begins to notice something strange. When Pedro raises his hand to answer a question, he says exactly the same words he said yesterday. Even his voice sounds the same. Peppa frowns quietly. During recess, the children go outside. Susie says, "Let's play!" But she says it exactly the same way she did yesterday. Peppa stops. "Susie, didn't we play this yesterday?" Peppa asks. Susie smiles and replies, "We always play here." Peppa isn't sure what she means. After recess, the children go back into the classroom. The lesson continues, but Peppa notices something else strange. The clock on the wall hardly moves. The minute hand stays almost in the same place. Peppa looks at the clock, then at the teacher. "Madame Gazelle, what time is it?" Peppa asks. The teacher calmly replies, "It's time to learn." Peppa looks a little confused. When the lesson ends, the children stand up and walk toward the door. Peppa is the last one to leave. She walks through the door and suddenly stops. In front of her is the same classroom again. The same board, the same desks, the same children. Susie is sitting in her place. Pedro raises his hand, and the teacher says again, "Good morning, children." Peppa slowly sits down at her desk. She begins to feel a little uneasy. "We already did this," she whispers. But the other children just continue with the lesson. Peppa tries to change things. She answers questions earlier than before. She tries to leave the classroom sooner. She even says different words, but everything around her continues almost exactly the same way. When the lesson ends again, she walks to the door very carefully. This time she watches closely where it leads. She opens the door and finds herself in the school hallway. Everything looks normal again. Children are laughing, talking, and getting ready to go home. Susie walks up to Peppa. "Do you want to play tomorrow?" she asks. Peppa slowly nods. Yes, tomorrow. She leaves the school and looks back at the building one more time. Now the school looks completely normal. When Peppa arrives home, Mummy asks, "How was your day at school?" Peppa thinks for a moment. "A little strange, but it was fine." Daddy smiles and says, "Sometimes school just feels longer than it really is." Peppa smiles too, but she still looks thoughtful. The episode ends with Peppa remembering the classroom for a moment and quietly saying, "I hope tomorrow will be a new day." The episode was called The Day That Repeats. It begins on a normal morning in Peppa Pig's house. Peppa wakes up, walks downstairs, and sees Daddy Pig sitting at the table reading his newspaper. Mummy Pig is making breakfast, and George is sitting on the floor playing with his dinosaur. Everything looks completely normal. Daddy Pig lifts his head and says, "Good morning, Peppa." Mummy smiles and says, "Breakfast is ready." Peppa sits down, eats her breakfast, and then walks to school. At school, everything seems normal too. The children sit at their desks, the teacher begins the lesson, Pedro raises his hand, and Susie whispers something to Peppa. After the lesson, everyone goes outside for recess and plays in the schoolyard. The day goes by calmly, and in the evening, Peppa returns home. She has dinner with her family, plays a little with George, and then goes to bed. But the next morning, something strange happens. Peppa wakes up again and hears Daddy's voice from the kitchen. "Good morning, Peppa." She walks downstairs and sees the exact same scene. Daddy Pig is sitting with his newspaper. Mummy Pig is making the same breakfast. George is playing with his dinosaur in the same spot. Everything looks exactly the same as yesterday. Peppa frowns. "We already did this yesterday," she says. But Daddy Pig just smiles and says again, "Good morning, Peppa." Peppa begins to notice more strange things. At school, Pedro raises his hand at the exact same moment. Susie says the same words. Even the teacher asks the same questions. During recess, the children play the exact same game. Peppa tries to change things. She answers questions earlier than before. She says different words. She suggests a new game, but the children still behave almost exactly the same way. The next day, everything repeats again. Peppa wakes up. Daddy Pig is reading the same newspaper. Mummy Pig says, "Breakfast is ready." George is playing with his dinosaur. Peppa tries something different. "Daddy, you're about to say good morning," she says. Daddy Pig smiles and replies, "Good morning, Peppa." Peppa looks surprised. At school, she tries to leave the classroom early, but she still ends up in the same place. She looks at the clock on the wall, but the hands barely move. By the end of the day, Peppa feels that something is very wrong. She sits quietly at her desk and whispers, "Why does everything keep repeating?" No one answers. Then Peppa slowly raises her head and looks straight ahead, as if she is looking directly at someone. For a few seconds, she says nothing. Then she quietly asks, "Do you see it too?" And the episode ends.